Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you all today at the first North American Bitcoin conference of this new decade. And earlier we heard from Bruce Fenton, who posed this question: is the next 10 years, these 2020s, is it going to be roaring or is it going to be something else? And I'm pretty confident that the next 10 years is going to be the most dynamic decade ever. And that's because we are entering into this new digital age where technologies are becoming part and parcel of everything that we do, part of business, part of life, part of society, deeply ingrained into our day-to-day. And there are lots of these new technologies that people talk about as being, extremely impactful: artificial intelligence, machine learning, new sources of energy, driverless cars, virtual and augmented reality, etc. But there's one technology in particular that I think is going to have a bigger impact than any other and is actually going to help to animate this new dynamic age. And that, of course, is the technology behind Bitcoin, and it's called the blockchain. I think the next 10 years are going to see the wholesale reinvention of money and capital and financial assets, and that is going to represent one of the biggest shifts and evolutions in our understanding of how the world works and how business works since well before the internet. In fact, I think it might even rival the introduction of the steam engine. This technology represents a lot. One thing it does represent is the second era of the internet. So let me explain what I mean by that. When you use the internet today to send and move and share information, you're not actually sending an original, unique thing. You're sending a version or a copy, and you're retaining an original. Now, for certain kinds of information, emails, text messages, websites, etc., being able to send copies is actually a great thing. It's kind of like everyone has their own printing press. So if I, put something onto Twitter, everybody who follows me can check it out. If I put an entry into Wikipedia, it's available for all to see. So this has had a very powerful democratizing effect on information. Except when it comes to things that have value, assets, capital, money, financial assets like stocks and bonds, and other forms of things which require scarcity, being able to send copies and make versions of the same thing is actually a terrible idea. So if I send someone money for something, it's important that they have the only version of it, and I can't send the same money to someone else. This is, of course, the double spend problem, and it's one of the main reasons why, despite the rise of the internet, we still largely rely on intermediaries, middlemen, to sit in the center of transactions and perform a bunch of important things. They do KYC and AML. Who's the buyer, who's the seller, who's the sender, who's the receiver. They perform all of the business logic, the clearing, settling, contracting, etc. And they establish trust. Now, these kinds of intermediaries, the ones that are familiar to us, of course, are banks and governments and the like, but increasingly large technology companies, digital conglomerates, and social media giants are filling that role. And overall, they do an okay job, but they have some very specific limitations. The first thing, obviously, is that they're centralized, and anything that is centralized is vulnerable to hacking or to attack. The second big issue is that they add cost and friction to transactions. It still takes days and weeks to clear and settle transactions in money and other financial assets, especially when it's global in nature. And the third big issue is that they capture all this data and information about us, which is problematic because that information can be misused, it can be hacked, it can end up in the wrong people's hands. And if you're dealing with these intermediaries, you're one of the lucky ones because they exclude about 1.5 billion people from the global economy. They're part of the world's unbanked that don't have a way to basically move and store value and access credit, the foundations of banking. So what if the internet were entering a second era, from an internet of information to an internet of value? 2008, Satoshi created Bitcoin, and even though he said in one of his emails that he was better with code than with words, he lucidly described a new kind of technology, basically cash for the internet, a way to move value peer-to-peer. And what was so fascinating about Bitcoin was that it actually worked. And it worked so well that it set off this spark which has caught on like wildfire and captured people's imaginations. There are lots of different industries where this technology is going to have a very profound impact. And we've examined this in numerous works. It's the part of the research we do at the Blockchain Research Institute, and it's also core to the book we released, Blockchain Revolution, which is the #1 selling book about blockchain in the world by far. It's been translated into 19 different languages, and it's available for sale. And it's also part of a new book which I'm releasing called Financial Services Revolution, which is going to be available on Amazon in a couple of weeks, and you can pre-order it today. And the focus of that book is not on blockchain's impact on many different industries, though that is obviously a very interesting opportunity. It's focused on financial services specifically. So who knows what that thing is that's on the screen there? It's called a Rube Goldberg machine. A Rube Goldberg machine is this device which performs a whole bunch of complex and oftentimes ridiculous steps in order to solve a very simple problem, like opening a door or cracking an egg or doing something like that. This is basically the way the financial services industry works today. And it's not immediately obvious to a lot of people. So you go to the Starbucks here in the Hyatt lobby and you tap your card on the card reader. They have tap card readers, right? In the US? I'm from Canada. Anyway, you tap your card on the card reader and the payment goes through and you think that the transaction has occurred. You think the money is in the merchant's hands, but it's not, of course. It's going through 5 or 6 different intermediaries. The acquiring bank for the merchant, your bank, it's going through a payment processing company. It's usually doing a risk check. And the money doesn't arrive instantaneously. It arrives 3 days later, and the merchant pays an interchange fee. You go and buy a stock. You think, wow, you can go onto E-Trade or Questrade or what have you. You buy a stock. It appears in your account. You think, gee, financial services is instant and frictionless, but it's not. It goes through at least 4 or 5 different intermediaries, broker-dealers, custodians, clearinghouses, the exchange, et cetera. And that stock may clear in a second, but it actually takes 3 days to settle. So everything that's happening in the background of the financial industry looks a lot like this. And it looks basically the way it did 40 years ago. That's about to change. So you'll hear a lot at this conference, no doubt you have in the past, about DeFi, decentralized finance. And I think DeFi is a very interesting concept. And this isn't said often, but actually the most effective and most widely used and most popular and most disruptive form of DeFi is actually Bitcoin. It's probably the most decentralized FI that there is out there. And it's going to obviously grow in value and importance. But I think around financial services, I'm talking about everything from accounting and audit to securities clearing and settling to credit markets and everything else, a lot of innovation is actually going to happen in the center, in what's called open finance. So somewhere between the legacy institutions of old, banks, central banks, payment processing things like ACH, which is the Fed system, or SWIFT, which is the international system, and the wide world of DeFi, in the center is where the rubber is going to hit the road. And it turns out that every single aspect of the financial services industry is poised to be disrupted in really profound ways. Now, the industry is this kind of complex, convoluted thing. At one point, it was the largest industry in the world. It's still a huge part of the international economy. And sometimes it can feel sort of bewildering to an outsider looking in. Now, I spent 10 years working in the financial services industry, and I can tell you that all of that complexity is by design. It's to bore you to sleep, to make sure you don't actually understand what's going on behind the surface. But when you really look at it, it basically does 9 relatively simple things. And I've outlined them here. Everything from establishing identity, to moving value, to storing value, to providing access to credit, to creating an environment for financial assets to be exchanged, traded, and bought, to accounting for information inside of a company, so organizing complex financial information, insurance, and the like. And I don't have time to go through every single one of these, but I'm going to talk about just 3 today. So let's talk about identity. You hear this a lot, and that's because it's true, which is that data is the most important asset class of the digital economy. But a lot of people say data is the new oil. That's wrong. Data is not the new oil. Data is the plant and equipment. So in the first era, of economic development, you had the feudal system, right? Lords and landowners who had serfs and peasants that worked the land. Then you had a period of industrial capitalism, where machinery and plant and equipment was the most important asset. And now data is the driver of value in the economy. And weirdly enough, the digital economy doesn't always resemble the industrial era. It actually more closely resembles the feudal era, where basically you're the serf that's tilling the land, creating this enormously valuable asset called data. And data is the foundation of the valuation of many large companies. Don't take my word for it. Just look at the market capitalization of the biggest companies in the world. Most of them are American data aggregators like Facebook and Amazon, Google, and others. And in the end, you don't get to participate in the value that that data generates. You get access to some free services. So it's sort of like you're a serf working the land, and you do all this labor for the landowner, and at the end of the day, you get a few cabbages to feed your family. This is an unsustainable model, and one that blockchain helps to solve. So it's possible now for individuals to own and control their own sovereign identity, where they decide how much of their information is shared given in any given economic transaction or any given interaction. So let's say you're going to buy something on the internet. It's not really necessary that the merchant knows who you are. It's only necessary that you have the money. You know, if I go to Starbucks and I give them cash, which is a bearer instrument, they don't ask me for my driver's license because they know that money is enough. That's how most e-commerce should work. There are other kinds of examples, like you're trying to get a loan from a bank to buy a house. They're going to want to know more information about you because they need to know whether or not your creditworthiness is enough to justify the loan. And that's fine, but it's up to you to provide informed consent over how that data is shared, not up to Equifax or some other third party, which is sharing that data with the bank without your consent. Another example, moving value. So Bitcoin is an effective way to move large amounts of money at relatively low fees over a medium time frame. If you're willing to wait and not pay transaction fees, you know, you're talking 10 minutes to a couple of hours. But at the smaller level of transactions, it doesn't actually work that well, at least not yet. And so what we've seen is this rise of a new kind of quasi-crypto asset, a stablecoin, which isn't a native digital currency. Its value doesn't derive from math alone. It usually derives from an asset that's held in custody somewhere else, right? So Tether, for example, or USDC, which we heard about, or JPM coin, or potentially Libra, and we'll see how that goes. And this is an interesting concept which has caught the attention of central banks. So the rise of CBDCs, as they're called, central bank digital currencies, helps to raise some really interesting and important questions, which is, do we really want central banks to be creating digital currencies? Will they resemble Bitcoin? Will they look like the censorship-resistant, semi-anonymous currencies of the crypto world, or will they be used as an instrument for state surveillance and state control? And what will they mean for the current monetary system that we know today? So the current monetary system was founded in 1944 at Bretton Woods, where basically the US, because it emerged from the Second World War with all of the gold and the largest economy in the world, got to set the terms. And so the US dollar became the global reserve currency. Some interesting people have come out against that, including Mark Carney, who's the outgoing governor of the Bank of England. And he actually argued that there should be a synthetic currency that's made up of a basket of CBDCs. And that should be the new medium of exchange, which is used for global trade and settlement. We'll see how that goes. Another initiative is coming out of the private sector world. So the first era of crypto innovation came out of, the internet, the civil society, out of cypherpunks, out of people who were pushing against the system. But they're a victim of their own success. This thing worked so well that now the two other big stakeholders, the state and private corporations or public corporations, are now taking an interest. And Facebook is one that has obviously shown a lot of interest in this. Not without some backlash or some scrutiny, and the scrutiny has kind of come from all sides. Now, what's interesting about Facebook's Libra is, you may recall during the summer of last year, where Mark Zuckerberg was hauled before Congress and he was forced to answer a bunch of questions. And what those hearings actually did was to help put Libra in stark relief to Bitcoin. And in fact, what ended up emerging from that was a lot of consensus that Bitcoin itself was actually this really useful, interesting, unstoppable thing. But it was actually Facebook's Libra that could be a big issue. And I remember afterwards, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal where someone said, the problem is not a crypto problem, the problem is a Facebook problem. And Facebook suffers from a lack of trust. But there's still reasons to be optimistic about Facebook's Libra and what it could mean for financial services. So there are still large parts of the world where people are unbanked, and there are many places where people are more likely to have a Facebook account than they are to have a bank account. So in the same way that in places like India, landlines were leapfrogged altogether, there are 30 million landlines in India, but 1 billion or more cell phone accounts, it's possible that you could see legacy banking infrastructure get leapfrogged entirely by some combination of native cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and these private initiatives like Libra. A third thing that's emerging right now is the rise of crypto assets that do lots of different things. And in the updated version of Blockchain Revolution, we tried to develop this taxonomy. Now, I'm not sure if this is the right way to think about it or if it's exhaustive. Maybe there are other categories. But it's quite obvious that cryptocurrencies aren't all currencies per se. A currency is a medium of exchange, a store of value, a unit of account. And there are lots of these tokens which do something else. Now, we saw lots of protocol tokens like Ether, utility tokens, which are usually distributed apps that live on top of these platforms emerge. And at this point, it's unclear, frankly, whether or not any of those are going to be successful, category 3. But where I do see a lot of opportunities in securities tokens, and Bruce talked about this earlier, but basically, a security, a stock, a bond, what have you, is just a contract. It is a contract that entitles you, the bearer, to some rights. So if let's say it's a stock, it entitles you to a share of a common enterprise, the ability to vote in certain matters regarding that enterprise, and access to cash flows if that company pays dividends. All of the logic of a security can be programmed into a smart contract and into a crypto asset. And it can radically reduce the complexity of how those markets work, but it can also broaden inclusion. It can make it easier for anyone to own them. And I think that's one of the areas where you're going to see a lot of innovation. So lots of reasons why I think this technology could be successful. There are many reasons why it might not reach its potential. I think we're too far along here to say it's going to fail. We're still early, but the contours and the outlines of this emerging revolution are quite clear. And at this point, the genie is out of the bottle. But let's explain or explore why it might not reach its potential. One of the big risks is regulators. State-backed institutions that may look at this technology and try to hamstring it or crush it. Another are the rise of large corporations that are looking to co-opt this technology for their own ends. So we don't end up with a fairer, more inclusive, more decentralized, and more private financial industry, but we end up where the landlords of the first digital age just strengthen their power and become more dominant. There are risks that the technology can't scale, that it's not ready for prime time. These are concerns which I think are being addressed, but we should not gloss over. And there's also risk that leaders of the old paradigm will push back. And of course, this is a notorious thing from Jamie Dimon. And it's funny to see Jamie Dimon say this thing, because anybody who's familiar with what banks are doing in the space knows that JP Morgan is probably spending more money than any legacy financial institution on this technology. And his comment is sort of endemic of something that happens often when there's a big shift or a big change in how people see the world. And we've seen this time and time again from people all throughout history. So I don't know if you can read these things, but you've got the coming of the wireless era will make war impossible. Well, that didn't work out. Democracy will be dead in 1950. That didn't work out. A rocket will never be able to leave the Earth's atmosphere. Well, that didn't work out. Here's a more recent one. There's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share, Steve Ballmer. I think Steve's a better NBA team owner than he was a CEO, quite frankly. So the thing about leaders of the old paradigm is they're often the last to embrace the new. At first, these new paradigms are met with derision and then scorn, and then they're actively fought against. But eventually, if something has the ability to change the world, it will. Now, the next 10 years, this next dynamic decade, I think will be a lot like the 20s, the 1920s. It will be a period of profound economic and cultural shift. But it's possible that like that decade, it ends in a big bang, a big catastrophe like the 1920s did. And that catastrophe might not be a stock market collapse and a depression. It might be something quieter, but maybe more insidious, which is we end up with a world where there are large stakeholders, governments and big companies, that control and dominate our economic lives online like never before. So will we end up with a world that is more inclusive and fair, more transparent and private, one where financial tools are put into the hands of many people, where there's an opportunity for everyone to succeed? Or will we end up with a surveillance society where money is just yet another tool of control of individual liberty and freedom? I don't know. The future's not something to be predicted, it's something to be achieved. But what I can tell you is that this is happening. So there's an old parable about the invention of chess, and it goes something like this. The king of the land, he's so pleased with this invention that he offers the creator anything he wants as a reward. And the creator of the game says, oh, you know, sire, I'm a humble man from humble origins. All I want is some rice to feed my family. But I'd like for you to give it to me in this way. 1 grain on the first piece of the chessboard, 2 grains on the second piece, 4 grains on the third, and so on and so forth. So the king, who I gather is like not a math guy, says, sure, whatever. How much rice could that be? You know, a big barrel of rice, a bag of rice. And he says, your wish is granted. Of course, 4 becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 32, becomes 64, and so on and so forth. So by halfway through the chessboard, it's more rice than the kingdom can produce in a year. And by the end of the chessboard, it's enough rice to cover the entire planet in 6 feet of rice. Small corollary to that story, which is that the king gets very pissed off at this guy, chops his head off. That's not going to happen to all of you, but this example illustrates the power of exponential change. The first digital era has taken us to the middle of the chessboard. The world today is very different than it was 50 years ago. What is the next era going to look like? I can tell you it's going to surprise us all, and I encourage you to be a part of this revolution. So thank you very much. Glad to be here.